Hello, beautiful community. We're going to talk about Zaluzhny's newsmaking interview, which made global news, not so much because he said terribly surprising things, but because he is the one who said those things. And that is what has enormous political significance and political resonance. We're going to look at the logic of Zaluzhny's views with plenty of quotes from Zaluzhny. And we'll focus on the interview he gave. On top of the interview, he also wrote an essay called Modern Positional Warfare and How to Win It, which is downloadable from The Economist, although it might be paywalled. But in the interview, he says quite a few things that come down to about three pillars. The first pillar is that the war is in a stalemate. The second pillar is that a long-distance perpetual war favors Russia, not Ukraine. And the third pillar is that to win, Ukraine needs some, perhaps unforeseen, technological innovation, which is beyond just the West giving Ukraine weapons, or even giving Ukraine more weapons and giving them more quickly. Let me straight away say what is going on in the Kremlin, because the trouble we've got is that as we read this Zaluzhny interview, not you guys, because all of you tend to know what's going on, but the Western voter increasingly will think about the war through the prism of domestic political arguments. And domestic political arguments about whether Ukraine should be supported are really taking off, above all in the United States. And many of these arguments are based on premises that aren't substantiated. And let me put on the table one premise that's very glaringly not substantiated. In fact, it's a piece of Kremlin propaganda. And it's very important not to tell your political opponents they're just reciting Kremlin propaganda unless that really is what they're doing. And on this occasion, there's good reason to say that it is what they're doing. Because the Kremlin's got this big politics, big kerfuffle that it's peddling around how it just wants to bite off the bit that it's bitten off and clear off. You know, it's been like this, it's been like that, it's been a year and a half, we've bitten this off, we've had to retreat here and there, we've bitten this bit off, please come on, let's negotiate and do a peace around the bit we've bitten off. Now, Ukraine doesn't want to do a peace, even though Ukraine, like Russia, may need a cessation of fire, a dramatic reduction of fire. Ukraine doesn't want to do a peace. Mr. Zaluzhny, who thinks the war is in a stalemate, doesn't want to do a peace. But neither does the Kremlin. And increasingly in the United States, you're hearing the argument, well, Ukraine doesn't want to do a peace, but Mr. Putin keeps saying, come on, we can do it. Let's do it. And so why are we holding out when we know that the war is in a stalemate and when Putin is ready to do a deal? And it's very clear in my analysis that Putin is not ready to do a deal. The idea of biting off this bit that he's bitten off and then clearing off is not just against Putin's preferences, it's an existential threat to his regime in his view. The perpetuation of this war, although there can be breaks and pauses in it, is for Putin tied to his conception of regime security. So a peace deal is for Putin not something he disfavors, it's an existential threat to his power. And given Putin's mystical floating about, it's a threat to the sustenance of contemporary Russian civilization and its appropriate political expression. So they are doing a song and dance about this. But if you actually offered it to them, they couldn't sustainably accept it because it would go against their core interest as they understand them. So no, the Kremlin is not ready to do a peace around the bit it's bitten off. Now, Mr. Peskov and indeed Zelensky have come out and said that it's not really a stalemate. They don't want to use that word. What can we learn from that? Well, I'm not in the know about this, but my presumption would be that when Zaluzhny gives this interview, he hasn't necessarily got a green tick about what he's going to say from the presidential administration in Ukraine. And the difference is that he can say it because there is some conflict there between the politicians and the military in Ukraine and pluralism, whereas in Russia there isn't. So Mr. Gerasimov might want to come out and say there is a stalemate, but he's certainly not allowed to do that, while Mr. Zaluzhny is. Let's look a little bit at what Zaluzhny says around this stalemate assumption. And his story is basically that there were the Russians throwing stuff at Bakhmut, and it seemed that they just weren't making any progress. And at the time, I was busy with planning the counteroffensive. This is what Zaluzhny is telling, The Economist telling Arkady Ostrovsky at The Economist. And so I didn't think about why they weren't making any progress. And then when we began to fail to make progress, I began to think about this. And I picked up a book about the First World War that gave me some answers and allowed me to draw some conclusions. Here is Zaluzhny himself. At first, he's saying that he had a hope that just the numbers Russians were losing might do them in politically, but then he rapidly discovered that that's not going to be the case. And you and I have talked about this endlessly, this very high capacity that Russia has to get lots of people killed. If Russia has a capacity problem, it's certainly not around how many people are getting killed. It may be, however, around how many people it can, without much resistance, pick up into the military. But once picked up, then the numbers of deaths don't really matter. And this is Zaluzhny speaking. This was my mistake. Russia's lost at least 150,000. And in any country, such casualties would have stopped the war. But the implication is not in Russia, because Russia's casualties are being compared by the regime to the First World War and the Second World War, not to what a country in the contemporary world might adequately find tolerable. And when we began, Zaluzhny goes on, now this is the stalemate point, to get stuck. At first, I thought there was something wrong with our commanders, Zaluzhny is speaking, so I changed them. Then I thought maybe our soldiers are not fit for purpose, so I moved soldiers in some brigades. And when those things didn't make a difference, The Economist is now saying, Zaluzhny told his staff to dig out a book he once saw as a student. Its title was Breaching Fortified Defense Lines, published in 1941 by the Soviet Major General Smirnov, who analyzed the battles of the First, not the Second, of the First World War. And here is Zaluzhny. And before I got even halfway through that book, I realized that is exactly where we are. Because just like then, the level of our technological development today has put us and our enemies in a stupor. Then he talks about going to Avdiivka and seeing just how the technological balance of power prevented the possibility of significant offensive progress. He says, I was in Avdiivka, and on our monitor screens that day, we saw 140 Russian machines ablaze, destroyed within 4 hours of coming within firing range of artillery. The simple fact is that we see everything the enemy is doing, and they see everything we are doing. In order for us to break this deadlock, we need something new, like the gunpowder which the Chinese invented and which we're still using today to kill each other. Now, is Zaluzhny calling for more weapons at this point? And the answer is, of course, he is. And he's doing it very respectfully. He's not saying, give it now. He's saying, the West is not obliged to give us anything, and we're grateful for what we've got. But here, I'm simply stating facts. The systems we've got now were most relevant to us last year, but they only arrived this year. And the same is going to be true with the F-16s. They're going to be, to a good degree, too late, and the Russians will be more prepared for them. He goes on, and now this point about technological innovation. It's important to understand that this war cannot be won with the weapons of the past generation and outdated methods. They will inevitably lead to delay and, as a consequence, defeat. And this leads to the point about a long-distance war. And the rough logic here is that Ukraine's going to run out of people more quickly. And Russia has people, Russia has much more money, and Russia has authoritarian resources to deploy. Now, that's a military argument, and I don't have the possibility to take a view on this argument. So a question arises, is Zaluzhny's point that Russia begins to win a long distance war an exaggeration, right, aimed at galvanizing Western support, or is he simply describing the way he sees things would go, with the view to then doing everything possible to prevent that? The biggest risk of an attritional trench war is it can drag on for years and wear down the Ukrainian state. So the commentary from The Economist is that there's no doubt in Mr. Zaluzhny's mind that a long war favors Russia, which has a population 3 times greater and an economy 10 times the size of Ukraine. Let's be honest, Zaluzhny says, it's a feudal state where the cheapest resource is human life. And for us, the most expensive thing we have is our people. We need to look for this solution. We need to find this gunpowder, quickly master it, and use it for a speedy victory. Because sooner or later, we're going to find that we simply don't have enough people to fight. So that's the Zaluzhny story, let me jump through a few political implications, having outlined the clear view that the Kremlin, in fact, is just running a propaganda story about how it's ready to do a peace deal. I think this interview realistically diminishes the capacity of Western leaders to seriously demand a presidential election in Ukraine, because things are hard, things are difficult, and just where do you go with it? And you've known my view for a long time that an election in Ukraine is not quite doable. The fact that there is a stalemate might mean that there's a real interest in cessation or partial cessation of fire. It does not mean that there's an interest in making a peace deal. There is an interest in the Western centers of power to get a peace deal. But the trouble is, Ukrainians don't want it, the Russians don't want it. And neither side wants it, and neither side even feels that it can stably even endure such an outcome. So that means that even though today Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine is down the pecking order in the news cycle, and Western leaders would love to keep it there, many of them, that's not going to be entirely possible, because there is no way out. This thing will keep going on, right? And capacity allowing, Putin is very much interested in this story becoming bigger, not smaller, over time. Make a distinction between peace negotiations and contact and some kind of dialogue and some kind of exchange between Russia and Ukraine that's probably going on via more or less direct means, possibly using third parties like Turkey. Isolationist, or we shouldn't support Ukraine voices, have already jumped on this interview. And as we know, there are three lanes for Western skepticism for supporting Ukraine. Not our war, we can't win it, we can't afford it. No, wrong. Not our war, we can't win it, and we don't know where our money is going. And this interview has triggered the second gambit. That's to say, well, we can't win it, Ukraine's saying they can't win it, and then Putin is saying that he's happy to make a deal, which of course he isn't. But he's saying that he's happy to make a deal, and lots of politicians either believe that or exploit that presentation by the Kremlin. So people are hovering over this. But does that mean that Zaluzhny has hurt Ukraine in any way with this interview? No, I don't think it does at all. I think overall an injection of truthfulness and realism into how we see the conflict is very, very important, as is an injection of truth and realism for Ukrainians, including the Ukrainians on the battlefield. One of the worst things to do in the medium term is to try to give people an impression that they're engaged in an enterprise that is completely different to the enterprise they're really engaged in. So I think that it's very positive to have this dose of realism. It will be exploited, but that's inevitable. And the bottom line about it is that you absolutely can't convert what Zaluzhny is putting on the table into the idea that you're going to get a peace deal. Zaluzhny doesn't want a peace deal. Ukraine doesn't want a peace deal. There's plenty of Ukrainians, particularly in the south and in the east of the country, are interested in some kind of negotiations. And indeed, to some extent, the Russian population is drifting in that direction too. But once you ask, well, what is it that you're prepared to give away, then we begin to run aground a little bit. But there is an understanding in Ukraine, there's a good understanding in Eastern Europe, that even if you gave away a part of Ukraine to Russia, that's not going to be a sustainable line. It's going to be a line which Putin will want to rework shortly afterwards. Putin is very keenly committed to that, not just because he is sort of mythically avaricious about changing the global order or global disorder, as we put it in the last main channel video, but it's because this is existential stuff for Putin. You know, he cannot have a peace deal. So we can't convert, right, this stalemate story into a peace deal. And because we can't convert it, there's only so far that you can drop this story down the news pecking order. It'll keep coming back again and again and again and again. And what are we being pushed into here? Well, we're being pushed into our realization that we've got some rather good partial strategy, right, in the West, and that's that Ukraine can't lose its sovereignty, that Ukraine must be independent, and that the war mustn't escalate, mustn't nuclearly escalate, but that's quite an incomplete strategy, and we need more. Right? And so let me now just give a couple of sentences before I let you go about what we haven't mentioned so far and what's not in Zaluzhny's interview. And it's two things. Number one, there is more that can be done to put pressure on Russia beyond just giving weapons to Ukraine, right? So we explore various forms of economic isolation that haven't been tried, or haven't been properly implemented. But the second thing that's really important is politicization of the Russian space. And that's what we talk about all the time. The West needs a strategy that contains tangible ideas around how to politicize the Russian space. Because our position on the Russo-Ukrainian war is that we have a half policy toward Ukraine, which is Ukraine stays independent, the war doesn't escalate. But we don't really have much of a policy toward Russia at all. And we need a more fully fledged policy toward both. Instead of having a good Ukraine policy and a good Russia policy, we have half a Ukraine policy and no Russia policy. That's what's missing from Zaluzhny's story, as well as all the non-military ways of putting pressure on Russia. Final remark about Zaluzhny is that he is clearly a man who is able to think for himself and to put into context military and political considerations, and reflect on the conflict, on Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, in a deeper and richer way than just somebody who leads a military. So that's in itself progressive and reassuring for Ukraine, despite the sobering nature of his analysis of where we're at today. Lots of love, talk soon.